Bruh, this is what I said in like chapter one. I think it was chapter one. I said I noticed how they kept calling the night an it. So I said, why are they calling it an it and not a they if it's Kris? And then with King Spade, I also said, hey, wouldn't the king recognize Kris if there's a knight? So I said this before, it's on record, but I couldn't make anything of it. I didn't think anything. I couldn't say anything. But now I'm pretty sure that Kris isn't the knight, which I don't know what that means because it makes sense that Kris opened the fountains, right? Before chapter one started, Kris opened the closet, right? And then when uh the knight took out Chris's soul, and at the end of chapter one, that's when they opened the library, dark world, right? And then at the end of chapter two, they opened the TV world. But also, we didn't see Kris do the other two, obviously because of spoilers, but also that could mean that we didn't see it because it wasn't them. And why did we see them open the TV world? Because in chapter 2, Queen literally tells them how to open a fountain at the end when Queen reveals that anyone with determination can open a fountain. It could just be that Kris just learned how to open a fountain there with Queen, so they aren't the knight. But I don't know. It's still really weird that it makes sense that they would open the internet world, the library world, when they took out their soul at the end of chapter one, right? But anyway, it's just something to think about. Uh, and also, I don't know what this means at all. Like, if Kris isn't the knight, then that truly would give great evidence towards the theory that it's Kris and the player. There's no knight in there; it's just Kris and the player. Which, honestly, I don't think I would mind too much if they twist it in a way that Kris isn't evil, and that as like neither the player nor Kris is evil. It's just it isn't a good thing that the player is controlling Kris, right? Kris, when they took out their soul at the end of chapter one, I don't know, it could have been just because they wanted to go eat the pie, right? Like at the start of chapter two. And when Kris slashed the tires, it could be because they don't want Susie to leave yet. They want Susie to stay over. And why they opened the fountain, because Kris is having a lot of fun in the fountain. Like Susie keeps saying how the dark world isn't bad, and so Kris doesn't want it to end either. So they learn how to open a fountain, and now they're gonna open one so they can keep having fun. So Kris isn't evil. They're just a little yeah, like what you just said. But I don't know. There's so many ways you could spin it. Kris is the knight. Kris is in the knight. The player's controlling them. The player's controlling them. Kris is evil. Kris isn't evil. There's so much that it's impossible. But yeah, also I was gonna say like mm, it's gonna be a completely different game. Uh, chapter three onwards, because like we're straight up not gonna see Bertley. They're gone. Unless they also pull like how in chapter one it ended with Kris taking off their soul, and then chapter two starts with Toriel uh screaming at them for eating the pie. So you're like, oh, haha, they took out their soul to eat the pie, right? Maybe they could say Bertley really just to be sleeping, right? Or maybe a coma. Maybe they're not dead, but we just gotta wait. There's so much, so much here, so much that it's impossible to theorize anything anymore. You can have all the theories, and we just have to wait and see. Kris is an evil. Kris is an evil. This confirms it for me. Kris is an evil. A voice unlike Kris, and then the moment where Kris just starts astral projecting and starts playing the piano and all that from the blog post, it's not Kris. It's just it's not Kris. So the question is just, is it the knight or is it the player, right? That's all there is to it. But Kris is not evil. Kris is not evil. And if Kris isn't evil, all the stuff Kris does, if we're assuming the soul is the player or the knight, then Kris's body, whatever the things that Kris does without their soul, is just misinterpreted. They're red herrings to make you think like they're evil, but they're not. And if we're thinking that there's no player, and the soul is Kris, and the body is the knight. Well, that just it's self-explanatory. But yeah, and Kris is not evil. Kris is not evil. A voice unlike Kris. Kris didn't decide any of that. The player or the knight did. Kris didn't. And the thing I was going to talk about earlier, something that seemed off to me, is when you kill Verdley and meet up with Rousey and Susie. Susie mentions how Kris doesn't look okay. Similar to how Kris didn't look okay after fighting Stanton in the normal route. That's telling me that something in Kris isn't okay with what just happened. And they're just not in control. But their facial expression and body is still showing that they weren't okay with what happened. Kris is an evil. Kris is an evil. Recently, there's been something different about them. Okay, come on. This is just pure confirmation that Kris is an evil. Yeah. So either their soulless body is... Okay, let's stop thinking that Kris is the knight. Kris is not the knight. Let's just go with the Kris and player theory. So their soulless body is just doing things that we're misinterpreting, and they're just red herrings. And the soul is the player. Okay. Now, what does this say about Spamton? The normal route Spamton. It's just the obvious answer, right? That Kris felt that way towards Spamton because Spamton was a puppet being controlled by something else and they couldn't free themselves. So they're scared that they will never be able to free themselves from the player. And it's not... I bet everything that it's not just the player, right? Obviously, it is all Gaster's thing, and the player, us, is just either Gaster or helper of Gaster doing all this. But enough thinking, just let's continue. It's just there's no point when everything will be revealed in due time. Oh my goodness. I hate thoughts! There's been a lot of dialogue talking about how Des and Azriel were good friends, possibly even dated. And now Des is missing, right? There's two things here. Azriel is evil, and Azriel put Des in a dark world. Or what I think is more likely, Des got lost somehow, maybe a dark world, and now Azriel is opening these dark worlds trying to find her. I don't know, just the thought. Soulless Kris is Kris, but Kris is an evil. Susie was going to go home. They were just gonna make the pie, and then she would have gone home. But because Kris slashed the tires, she stayed over. So it was that Kris wanted her to stay over. Definitely. Like, look at Spamton's limbs. He was just being controlled by strings, right? That's how Kris feels. Without their strings, their soul, then they just limp around. And that's what they're most afraid of. They can't live without their soul. And that's what scares them. The moment they take it out for good, they'll just end up dying, like Spamton. Yeah, Kris not being the knight makes a lot of sense the more you think about it. It would be too obvious, right? Literally, they hint to it in chapter 1, and then they straight up show you in chapter 2. Way too soon to reveal such a plot twist like that in a 7-chapter game, right? They're obvious red herrings. And then when you think about how the queen literally explained how to make dark fountain in chapter 2, and then Kris makes one, it really gets you. It really makes you think.
I also wanted to add some extra thoughts that I recently thought of. During the Snowgrave Spamton fight, I was editing my video to upload my clear, and I realized that I realized this in my clear, but I didn't put much thought into it. My thoughts being that Kris called out to Susie and Ralsei when you were calling out to friends when Spampton used the blue shine, whatever. The text box said Kris called out for help, but nobody came. Kris called out for Susie and Ralsei. Kris themselves did this. Kris, the character, the body, called out to Susie and Ralsei. And I'm thinking, they did this because they didn't want to use Noelle again. They didn't want to let you, the player, use Noelle again. They just wanted help from their friends Susie and Ralsei. They wanted to let Noelle alone. They don't want to make Noelle suffer anymore and use her as a tool. But obviously, Ralsei and Susie don't come. So Kris gives up and lets you take control again. And then when you choose Noelle, what does the text box say? It says you whispered Noelle's name, not Kris. You, the player. Kris wanted to save Noelle from being used, so Kris called out to Susie and Ralsei. That didn't work. And then you, the player, called out to Noelle, and it worked. I don't know what it means truly, but what I take from it is that Kris, again, is not evil, and they don't want to use Noelle, so they tried calling out to Susie and Ralsei first, before you came in and used Noelle again. And one last thing is... Wait. So that was all I wanted to add. Something I noticed during editing. I am confident that Kris is not evil. And either the knight or the player makes more sense. It's controlling them. But not everything that happens when the player is in control is meaningless to Kris. Something I was worried about is like, if we're controlling Kris the whole time during the Dark World and such, then is it all meaningless? None of this matters to Kris. Kris isn't friends with Susie or Ralsei, but no, I don't think so, because first off, if we are saying Kris is Kris, then them opening the fountain means that they are having fun with Susie and Ralsei, so they want more Dark Worlds to play in, right? So they do love their friends. And the biggest point is what I just talked about. Kris trying to call out to Susie and Ralsei first, their friends, before even thinking of Noelle, because they wouldn't want to use Noelle again after Kris saw what you were doing with Noelle. So yeah, that was it. A bit longer than I wanted it to go on for, but yeah, I'm confident that Kris is not evil.